It began like every other glittering night in Manhattan. A swirl of flashing cameras, velvet ropes, and the hum of anticipation rippling through the air. The Project Healthy Minds World Mental Health Day Gala was not just another charity event. It was the crown jewel of the season, a gathering of powerful names, public figures, and philanthropic leaders whose presence alone carried weight. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The red carpet shimmered with sequins, spotlights glared, and the press pit buzzed like an electrical storm. But behind the polished smiles and carefully chosen words, something else was brewing. Something raw, unscripted, and volatile. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had arrived that evening not just as honorees but as symbols, representatives of resilience, compassion, and modern royalty redefined. They were there to accept the Humanitarians of the Year award, a recognition meant to celebrate their work in mental health advocacy and social awareness. For the organizers, it was a public relations dream. For the couple, it was supposed to be a fresh start, an opportunity to reassert their credibility and remind the world that despite the controversies and the headlines, their mission was still rooted in empathy and purpose. But as the saying goes, not everything that glitters is gold. Beneath the gala's perfect facade, cracks were forming, subtle at first, visible only to those close enough to sense the tension in the air. A stiff glance here, a forced smile there. Cameras caught only the performance, but insiders would later say they could feel the unease radiating off the couple like static electricity. The night unfolded as it always does at such events. Cocktails, small talk, speeches that mixed sincerity with self-congratulation. Meghan's speech was to be the highlight, a heartfelt address about mental wellness and overcoming societal pressure. Staff members whispered backstage about how she had rewritten it multiple times in the weeks leading up to the event. Harry, some said, had grown increasingly anxious, wanting the message to focus on collective healing rather than personal struggle. Meghan, on the other hand, wanted it to feel emotional, vulnerable, and distinctly hers. By the time the couple took the stage, the applause was warm, though not overwhelming. The crowd's reaction was polite, perhaps even restrained. The pressure of that moment, of being judged not just by what they said but how they said it, hung in the air like invisible smoke. Meghan began her speech confidently, her tone precise, her posture commanding. Yet those who knew her well noticed the tightness in her jaw, the quick glances toward Harry, the way his hands remained clasped in front of him, motionless. When she finished, there was applause again, but a kind that felt measured rather than passionate. Harry stepped up for his part, offering a few words of gratitude. His delivery was calm, rehearsed, almost detached. Cameras captured a brief moment between them. A nod exchanged, a fleeting look that some later described as cold. It was the kind of look that meant something had gone wrong, something subtle yet significant. Then, as the lights dimmed and the crowd shifted toward the dinner portion of the gala, everything changed. Backstage was a different world, stripped of the glamour, humming with chaos, sweat, and logistics. Staff moved briskly, stagehands whispered into earpieces, and photographers sorted through their shots for social media. Amid the commotion, Harry and Meghan retreated to a private holding area, away from prying eyes. What happened next was supposed to remain there, unseen, unheard. But someone, an anonymous member of the production staff, had a phone rolling quietly in their pocket. That recording, blurry and muffled though it was, would become the most talked about footage of the year. The video that eventually surfaced didn't last more than a minute and a half, but it was enough to send shockwaves through every corner of the internet. The sound quality was rough, the lighting poor, but the argument was unmistakable. Voices rose and overlapped, sharp and emotional. Meghan's tone was clipped, frustrated, her gestures visible even through the shaky camera movement. Harry's responses were quieter but strained, the kind of low voice one uses to contain anger in public. No one outside that room could say exactly what triggered the exchange, but those who heard it recognized the exhaustion in their voices. It wasn't the first time the couple had been accused of friction under pressure, but this was different. It was raw, unfiltered, unedited. Gone were the glossy interviews, the choreographed documentaries, the rehearsed soundbites about unity and purpose. What the world saw in that footage was not the image of a royal couple saving the world. It was two people, cornered by expectation and perhaps by each other. The clip spread across social media platforms like wildfire. Within hours, it had been reposted, dissected, slowed down, and analyzed frame by frame. Experts debated whether it was authentic or a deepfake, but insiders confirmed the truth soon after. It was real. The authenticity made it even more devastating. For the Project Healthy Minds team, the leak was catastrophic. Their carefully built reputation as a haven for mental health awareness was suddenly entangled with one of the most high-profile celebrity meltdowns of the decade. Donors called for explanations, media outlets camped outside their offices, and social media turned the once inspiring gala into a global spectacle of scrutiny. For Harry and Meghan, it was personal and political at once. Their entire public persona, built on the ideals of emotional honesty, compassion, and mutual respect, was now being weighed against a single outburst caught on camera. Questions poured in from every direction. Was their marriage in trouble? Were they under too much pressure? Did the event itself spark old wounds? The narrative quickly shifted from celebration to controversy, from admiration to pity, from admiration to doubt. But before any of that unfolded publicly, there was the immediate moment, the private aftermath when the shouting faded and silence took over. A staffer recalled seeing Meghan walk out of the holding area, head high, expression unreadable. Harry followed minutes later, his face pale, his eyes fixed downward. They exited separately, both maintaining composure as though nothing had happened. In front of the remaining cameras, they smiled again. The illusion was restored, but the damage had already been done. Behind closed doors, frantic calls were made. Meghan's team wanted the footage buried. Harry's team wanted a statement drafted. Project Healthy Minds wanted answers about how their Backstage had turned into a tabloid battlefield. Lawyers were looped in. Confidentiality clauses were reviewed. But none of it mattered anymore. The clip was already viral. The world had seen what was never meant to be seen. The public reaction split instantly. Some sympathized, saying the couple had endured unimaginable pressure and deserved privacy. Others saw it as hypocrisy, pointing out that the pair had built their fame on openness but were furious when transparency cut too close. Late-night hosts joked about the Royal Fight Club. Tabloids invented headlines faster than fact-checkers could respond, and royal commentators filled hours of airtime debating what the argument meant for the monarchy's exiled son. Through it all, one truth became clear. The footage was more than a scandal. It was a symbol. A reflection of how even the most curated lives can unravel under the microscope. A reminder that image and reality often exist on parallel tracks, never quite meeting. As the days went by, new questions surfaced. Who leaked the clip? Was it an act of revenge, a breach of ethics, or an inside warning? Some suspected a disgruntled staffer. Others whispered it might have been part of a larger campaign to discredit the couple. Theories multiplied, each more sensational than the last, but the truth remained elusive. Yet beneath all the speculation, something more human pulsed at the center of it all. A story about pressure, identity, and the breaking point of two people constantly performing for a world that refuses to look away. The gala, once intended as a platform for hope and awareness, had turned into a mirror reflecting the very fragility it sought to heal. And in that mirror stood Harry and Meghan, no longer just figures of fame or controversy, but symbols of how even those who preach mindfulness can lose control under the relentless weight of expectation. By the time the news cycle began to shift, the couple had gone silent. Their representatives issued a brief, carefully worded statement emphasizing commitment to mental health advocacy and respect for privacy. But the tone was different this time, measured, defensive, hollow. The energy that once fueled their cause seemed replaced by exhaustion. And for those who witnessed the scene firsthand, the memory lingered. The shouts, the tension, the silence that followed. The truth that, no matter how polished a public image may be, the human heart remains unpredictable and sometimes uncontainable. This was no ordinary celebrity drama. It was the moment when the illusion of perfect control cracked open and revealed the messy, unfiltered truth of two people living under the brightest spotlight imaginable. And as that backstage footage continued to echo across screens worldwide, one question remained. What happens when the story you tell the world collides with the reality you can no longer hide? New York City has always known how to host a spectacle, but on that particular October evening, even seasoned attendees whispered that the Project Healthy Minds Gala had outdone itself. The hotel ballroom chosen for the event glittered with chandeliers the size of small constellations. Every table shimmered with mirrored centerpieces reflecting the soft golden light, while the scent of expensive perfume mixed with the aroma of wine and polished wood. Waiters moved with synchronized precision, their black uniforms blending into the shadows as guests in sequined gowns and tailored tuxedos mingled beneath the towering floral arrangements. It was an evening designed to impress, to photograph beautifully, and to remind those in attendance that compassion and glamour could coexist. The Project Healthy Minds organization had built its reputation as a bridge between celebrity influence and genuine mental health advocacy. Its World Mental Health Day Gala was not simply a fundraiser. It was a declaration of influence. Attending meant being seen, and being seen meant you mattered. Behind the glamour, there was a silent competition among the elite for visibility and approval. Every smile was deliberate, every handshake calculated, every camera angle considered. And into this intricate web of presentation stepped Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, whose every public appearance carried the weight of both admiration and controversy. From the moment their motorcade approached the venue, a different kind of energy spread through the crowd. Reporters adjusted their microphones. Fans raised their phones. Even the photographers, jaded professionals who had seen it all, tensed their fingers on the shutter buttons. This was not just another celebrity couple arriving at a gala. This was royalty, albeit a self-exiled version of it, walking into a world that alternately adored and resented them. When Harry and Meghan stepped out of the car, flashbulbs exploded like a storm. Meghan wore a sleek black gown that clung to her with quiet confidence, her hair pulled into an elegant bun, a minimalist diamond bracelet catching the light. Harry, in a classic tuxedo, stood slightly behind her, his expression polite but serious. The crowd cheered, though there was an undertone of curiosity rather than pure excitement. They had come to see if the couple who once symbolized hope could still command the same awe. Inside, the atmosphere changed from frenzied to reverent. Event coordinators moved quickly to escort the couple toward their table, cameras following every movement. Meghan smiled graciously, exchanging nods with board members and sponsors. Harry shook hands firmly, but those who watched closely noticed something in his demeanor, a stiffness, an unease. He had always been less comfortable with the performative aspect of public life, and tonight, the act felt heavier than usual. The couple's arrival was the highlight of the evening's first hour. Organizers had carefully scheduled their entrance, their seating, and even the timing of their conversation points to maximize visibility without overwhelming the agenda. Every second was scripted, every encounter measured. Yet as Meghan leaned toward Harry to whisper something, his faint nod and half-smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Theirs was a partnership constantly under review, and tonight, the invisible tension between them was almost tangible. The speeches began soon after. The host of the evening, a renowned talk show personality known for blending charm with advocacy, welcomed guests and spoke about breaking the stigma around mental health. Applause rippled through the room, but it wasn't the speaker that the audience kept glancing at. It was the Sussexes. Every time the word resilience or healing was mentioned, every time the topic of pressure or vulnerability arose, eyes shifted toward their table as though waiting for a reaction. They were no longer just participants in the event. They had become its unspoken center of gravity. As the evening progressed, the media presence intensified. Camera crews hovered discreetly at the edges, capturing candid moments. Meghan's laughter at a table joke, Harry adjusting his cufflinks, a fleeting exchange of glances between them. All were silently documented. The couple's image was a currency, and every gesture added value. Yet those who worked the event backstage could sense the strain. One of the organizers later recalled how the Duchess seemed focused to the point of tension, and how Harry barely touched his meal. Behind the curtain, event staff whispered nervously about timing, lighting, and stage order. Meghan's speech was slotted as the emotional centerpiece of the evening. She had written it herself, and revisions had been coming in until the very last minute. There were notes in the margins of her copy, underlined phrases, rewritten sentences. It was personal, meant to connect her own struggles with the larger theme of the night. Harry, however, had reportedly expressed reservations. He worried it might sound too self-referential, that critics would accuse them of making the moment about themselves rather than the cause. Their differing instincts, hers toward emotional storytelling, his toward restraint, had become a familiar point of contention. When their time to take the stage finally arrived, the ballroom hushed. Meghan led the way, her posture perfect, her face serene. Harry followed, smiling briefly at the audience before taking his place beside her. The applause was warm but subdued. As Meghan began to speak, her voice was steady, clear, and melodic. She spoke about the importance of compassion, the invisible struggles people face, and the need for community. Her words were polished and sincere, but there was something rehearsed in the rhythm. The audience listened attentively, but few were truly moved. Harry took the microphone next. His tone was measured, his speech shorter. He thanked the organizers, praised the mission of Project Healthy Minds, and made a passing remark about how sharing one's pain can heal others. His sincerity was unquestionable, but his delivery lacked energy. Cameras caught a fleeting moment when Meghan looked at him as he spoke. Her expression unreadable, her eyes sharp. To the casual observer, it was nothing. To those who knew their dynamic, it was a signal of unspoken disagreement. As they left the stage, applause followed them again, polite and practiced. A handful of journalists scribbled notes. Others glanced at their phones. The night went on. Courses served. Laughter resumed. Champagne flowed. But for the couple, something had shifted. Backstage, the air felt thicker, heavier. Staff members later recalled sensing tension between them as they walked toward their private suite. One witness remembered Meghan asking for a brief moment alone. Another claimed Harry looked irritated, pacing near the door. None of them could hear the words, only the tones, low, sharp, rising, then falling. The incident would soon fade into whispers until the footage emerged, but in that moment, before any leak or scandal, there was already a storm building quietly behind their composed faces. The pressure of the evening had been immense. The couple had carried the weight of royal history, global expectation, and personal redemption all at once. To the audience, the event was a night of celebration. To Harry and Meghan, it was another test, a performance they couldn't afford to fail. And yet, for all the polish and planning, what happened that night proved that even perfection can fracture when the lights are too bright and the air too thin. By the end of the evening, the applause had faded, the speeches were over, and guests began to leave with their designer coats and practiced smiles. But for the Sussexes, the night was only beginning. What unfolded backstage after the final applause would soon redefine how the world saw them, not as icons of resilience, but as human beings caught in a moment of unbearable pressure. It was the calm before the chaos, the silent buildup before the storm. Every camera flash, every whispered remark, every smile forced under the weight of expectation had been leading to that moment. And while the audience went home inspired by the cause, no one imagined that behind the velvet curtains, the story taking shape would become one of the most discussed scandals of the year. The Project Healthy Minds Gala had been designed to celebrate empathy and understanding. But by the time the lights dimmed and the couple retreated behind the scenes, empathy gave way to exhaustion, and understanding was replaced by confrontation. The glittering facade had held strong for a few hours, but underneath, it had already begun to crack. The world would soon see what that crack revealed. The morning after the gala, the city woke to headlines celebrating another successful night for Project Healthy Minds. Social media feeds filled with photos of smiling celebrities, inspirational quotes about mental health, and well-crafted posts praising the event's noble mission. For a few short hours, It looked as though the night had achieved everything it was meant to. But then, without warning, the tone of the conversation changed. It began quietly, as these things always do. A short clip appeared on an obscure celebrity gossip account with fewer than 10,000 followers. The video was grainy, the audio muffled, but the caption beneath it was unmistakable. What really happened backstage after Meghan Markle's speech? At first, late one night, 3 days after the leak, an anonymous email reached a major news outlet. Attached was a short message. "You've only seen part of it." The sender claimed there was more footage, longer and clearer, showing the full context of the argument. Whether that email was real or a hoax remained uncertain, but it reignited the frenzy. Reporters began speculating that the confrontation had begun earlier in the evening, perhaps before Meghan's speech. Theories grew wilder by the hour. Some said Harry had objected to something she said on stage. Others claimed Meghan was upset about his lack of enthusiasm during the event. One tabloid even suggested a dispute over their seating arrangements. The truth was still buried under speculation, but the noise surrounding it had already rewritten the story. In the days that followed, the couple's allies reached out privately, urging calm. Close friends tried to shift the narrative back to the event's purpose, mental health awareness, but it was a losing battle. The internet had already chosen its version of the story. The glamorous royal rebels had finally cracked under the weight of their own contradictions. At Project Healthy Minds, the leadership team convened one final emergency meeting to address the growing backlash. Statements were drafted, then discarded. Legal advisors warned against implicating staff before the internal investigation was complete. Some employees resigned quietly, unable to withstand the media pressure. The organization's founder, known for his optimism, described it as a test of integrity in the age of spectacle. But deep down, everyone knew the damage was irreversible. In the chaos of that week, one thing became clear. The footage had done more than capture a private argument. It had exposed the fault line between appearance and authenticity, between advocacy and reality. The couple who once defined themselves by their openness were now caught in a moment they never intended to share. And as the world dissected every pixel of that 93-second clip, the illusion of control that had sustained them began to crumble. The footage was no longer just a viral video. It had become evidence in the public trial of their reputation, a mirror reflecting what fame does when sincerity meets exposure. And for Harry and Meghan, that mirror was suddenly impossible to look away from. Hours before the footage was recorded, before the shouting and the viral chaos that would come to define the gala, the atmosphere behind the stage at the Project Healthy Minds event was one of quiet urgency. Stagehands moved like shadows across the dimly lit corridors, adjusting cables and checking lighting cues. Assistants whispered updates into headsets, while photographers lingered near the curtained entrance, hoping to catch a candid moment before the couple appeared. Backstage, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were in a private waiting area set up for the evening's honorees. The room was elegantly understated, cream-colored walls, soft gold lighting, and a long mirror flanked by 2 chairs. A tray of sparkling water and a plate of untouched hors d'oeuvres sat on the side table. Outside, the muffled hum of the crowd filtered through the heavy curtains, a rhythmic pulse of expectation that neither of them could ignore. Meghan was standing by the mirror, reviewing her note cards one last time. She had rehearsed the speech countless times, even that morning at their hotel suite. She knew every word, every pause, every emotional inflection. But she also knew the weight it carried. This wasn't just a speech, it was her statement to the world that she belonged among global leaders in the mental health conversation, not merely as a celebrity spouse but as a voice in her own right. Harry sat in silence across from her, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze unfocused. The tension between them had been building all day, invisible yet undeniable. Earlier, at the hotel, he had voiced concern that the tone of her speech was too personal, that it risked turning a mental health event into something that felt self-promotional. Meghan had brushed off his worry with a calm, almost dismissive assurance that authenticity connects people. He hadn't argued further, but his silence had said more than words could. As the minutes ticked down, Meghan looked up from her cards. "You're quiet again," she said softly, her voice edged with fatigue. Harry glanced at her reflection in the mirror. Just thinking, he replied. You know how these nights go. Everyone watches, everyone judges. She turned toward him, her expression unreadable. That's exactly why we have to own the narrative. If we don't, someone else will. He nodded but didn't respond. The air between them thickened. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the kind of tension born from two people who had been carrying too much for too long, each certain that the other didn't fully understand their burden. A knock on the door broke the silence. 5 minutes, a stage coordinator called. Meghan smiled briefly at her reflection, adjusting a stray strand of hair. Let's just get through tonight, she murmured, more to herself than to him. They walked toward the stage together, side by side but not quite in step. As they waited in the wings, they could hear the host's voice carrying through the speakers, introducing them with grandeur and praise. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our humanitarians of the year, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Applause erupted, a polite but eager swell of noise. Harry turned to Meghan. After your speech, let me handle the thank yous, he said in a low tone. She glanced at him, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. It's fine. I'll cover it. He hesitated. Just, let's not overdo it. Her lips tightened, but she said nothing. When the stage manager signaled, Meghan stepped forward first, her stride purposeful. Harry followed, adjusting his jacket as the lights hit their faces. The applause faded into quiet anticipation as they reached the podium. Meghan began to speak, her voice strong and polished. She thanked the organization, praised the importance of mental health awareness, and spoke about breaking the stigma of emotional struggle. It was the kind of speech that sounded perfect on paper, eloquent, vulnerable, inspiring. Yet for those who knew her well, there was a faint brittleness beneath the calm delivery, a tension that betrayed how carefully she was holding herself together. Harry stood slightly behind her, smiling at intervals, nodding at key points. To the audience, he appeared supportive. But backstage staff watching on the monitors noticed how still he was, how his eyes occasionally drifted toward the floor. When Meghan made a point about individual courage in the face of public pressure, his expression tightened just slightly. When her speech concluded, the room applauded politely. She smiled graciously and handed the microphone to Harry. His tone was measured, his words brief. He thanked the hosts and acknowledged the importance of open dialogue in mental health, emphasizing collective effort over individual spotlight. It was a subtle but unmistakable contrast to Meghan's tone. When they exited the stage, the applause followed them, but neither spoke as they made their way backstage. The corridor was narrow, lined with cables and black curtains. A few staff members offered quiet congratulations, which Meghan acknowledged with a nod. Harry said nothing. The first words between them came once they were out of sight of the cameras. You changed it, he said, his voice controlled but cold. Meghan turned slightly, frowning. What are you talking about? The ending. You said you weren't going to bring up the press stuff. That line about being judged for being too outspoken. That wasn't in the version you showed me. Her shoulders stiffened. I added it because it mattered. People needed to hear that. He shook his head. This was supposed to be about the cause, not about us. Us? She repeated, her tone sharpening. You think acknowledging the pressure we face doesn't connect to mental health? That's the whole point. It's not the same, he replied quietly. You turned it into something else. A few crew members nearby exchanged nervous glances, pretending not to listen. The couple's voices were still controlled, but their tension filled the small space like a storm about to break. Do you have any idea how hard it is to stand up there knowing people are waiting to tear me apart? She continued. Every word, every look, everything I do is twisted. Harry met her gaze. And do you think I don't know that? I've lived it my whole life. But you don't fight fire with more fire. Her jaw clenched. You think being quiet ever helped you? It didn't protect you then, and it's not protecting us now. The exchange might have ended there, but a photographer rounded the corner at that exact moment, camera in hand, looking for candid shots. Meghan quickly composed herself, smiling. Harry's expression froze into neutrality. The photographer, unaware of the tension, snapped a quick picture and moved on. Once he was gone, the silence between them was deafening. A production assistant approached, asking if they'd like to head to the private lounge before dinner. Meghan nodded curtly, walking ahead. Harry followed, slower, his eyes fixed on the floor. In the lounge, away from the noise of the event, they found a brief reprieve. But silence only deepened the divide. Meghan sat at the edge of a sofa, scrolling through her phone, reading early headlines about the speech. "They're saying it was powerful," she murmured. "Some called it the highlight of the night." Harry didn't answer. He removed his jacket and placed it on the chair beside him. "They'll say that tonight," he said finally. "Tomorrow, they'll twist it again." She exhaled sharply, setting her phone down. "You always expect the worst." "I've learned to," he replied, his voice low. "It's the only way to survive it." For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of everything, the expectations, the public scrutiny, the years of defending themselves, settled like a fog around them. The fight that would soon erupt wasn't born in that moment. It had been building quietly for months, perhaps years. The gala was merely the spark. A few minutes later, a coordinator informed them they were needed for post-event photos. Meghan nodded, but as the door closed behind the staff member, she looked at Harry again. "Just tonight," she said softly, almost pleading. "Let's just get through tonight without another headline." He gave a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll try." They stood up together, adjusting their clothes, straightening their expressions. The door opened to the hallway again, and the noise of the event washed over them like a wave. The illusion was restored. Cameras flashed, smiles returned. But just beneath the surface, something had already cracked. Later, when the leaked footage emerged, analysts would point to this timeline as the prelude, the invisible thread connecting the poised stage presence with the unguarded outburst that followed. The hours leading up to that moment revealed not a sudden explosion, but a slow unraveling. What the world saw as a scandalous argument was, in truth, the visible result of years of pressure pressing inward, until even their most rehearsed smiles couldn't contain it. And as they stood in front of those flashing lights, unaware that someone nearby was already holding a phone at the ready, the stage was set, not for the night's award, but for its aftermath. The leak sent tremors far beyond the glittering walls of the Project Healthy Minds Gala. Within hours, what had been a controlled, meticulously managed public event turned into an international frenzy. Yet while the public focused on the viral footage, another story was unfolding behind the scenes. One driven by whispers, conflicting loyalties, and the people who had actually been there when everything unraveled. It began with anonymous emails. Journalists started receiving cryptic messages from self-proclaimed insiders who claimed to have been working backstage that night. The first came from someone using the alias Cobalt, a name that meant nothing until editors noticed the sender's email domain traced back to an event management firm contracted for the gala. The message was brief. It wasn't the first argument that night. What you saw was only the end of it. Hours later, another message surfaced, this time from someone claiming to be part of the production staff. "There was tension all evening," it read. "It started before they even went on stage. You could feel it, like static in the air." By the next day, major media outlets had dozens of leads. Some were genuine, others opportunistic, but a pattern began to emerge. Multiple sources independently described the same series of events. Disagreements over the speech, visible irritation between the couple, and frantic efforts by staff to keep everything under wraps. The story was no longer just about a leaked video. It was about a culture of control, image management, and fear of imperfection that surrounded the Sussexes wherever they went. One staff member, speaking under the condition of anonymity, told a journalist, "They're not monsters. They're just exhausted. You could see it in their eyes. It's like they're carrying 1,000 conversations that never end." Another described the atmosphere backstage as unbearably tense, noting that everyone was walking on eggshells, trying not to make eye contact when they passed. A A sound technician offered more specific insight. "I was working near the audio booth when they came off stage," he recalled. "At first, it was just low voices, nothing alarming. Then suddenly, her tone changed, sharp, defensive. His response was calm, but you could tell he was frustrated. I remember thinking, this is not going to stay quiet for long." An assistant working for one of the sponsors confirmed that event organizers had immediately tried to prevent the incident from spreading. "We were told not to discuss anything we saw backstage," she said. "There were instructions to delete any behind-the-scenes photos from our phones. One of the senior managers even reminded us that NDAs were still in effect. But in a world fueled by smartphones and instant sharing, silence was a luxury that no one could enforce for long. The footage had already escaped into the digital wild before those orders went out. Someone had captured what everyone else had been too afraid to talk about." Among those who spoke out, opinions varied sharply about what the argument meant. One insider, who had worked on previous charity events with the couple, suggested that the tension reflected deeper personal struggles. "They both believe in what they do," the source said, "but sometimes belief turns into pressure. They're constantly trying to prove themselves, not to the world, but to each other." Others painted a less sympathetic picture. A volunteer who had been near the service hallway described Meghan as furious and Harry as defeated. "It looked like she was scolding him for something that happened on stage," the volunteer said. "He didn't yell back. He just stood there, nodding, like he was trying to calm her down." A different witness contradicted that account, insisting that Meghan's frustration wasn't directed at Harry but at the event's staff. "She was upset about the sound levels," they claimed. "She thought her microphone had cut out for a few seconds during her speech. She kept asking why no one fixed it." The conflicting reports only deepened the mystery. What was clear, however, was that the altercation had not been a private moment between two isolated individuals. It had unfolded in a space filled with witnesses, each seeing it through their own lens of loyalty, fatigue, or fear. As media pressure intensified, Project Healthy Minds launched an internal review. Staff were interviewed, security footage was examined, and all contractors were asked to sign reaffirmations of confidentiality. The organization's leadership wanted answers. Who had leaked the video, and why? But the investigation quickly hit a wall. Access to backstage areas had been limited to a small circle of professionals, none of whom admitted involvement. The phone used to record the footage couldn't be traced. The uploader had used VPNs, fake accounts, and encrypted communication to remain hidden. One internal memo leaked later that week captured the panic inside the organization. "We must regain control of the narrative," it read. "This incident, though regrettable, must not overshadow our mission. All external communications must emphasize the importance of mental health awareness and the human side of vulnerability." Ironically, it was that same memo that reignited the controversy. Critics accused Project Healthy Minds of prioritizing damage control over compassion. "They talk about mental wellness," one journalist wrote, "but when a real moment of struggle happens, they scramble to hide it instead of addressing it." As for the Sussexes, their inner circle closed ranks. Publicly, their representatives maintained silence beyond the initial statement. Privately, however, frustration grew. A source close to the couple told a major U.S. outlet, "They feel betrayed. They trusted that environment. It was supposed to be a safe space, a platform for good, not a trap." Another insider revealed that Harry wanted to confront the organization directly, but advisors urged restraint. "He was furious," the source said, but Meghan insisted they wait until things calmed down. She didn't want to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing them lose control again. Meanwhile, the press kept pushing. Reporters tracked down former staff members, caterers, technicians, anyone remotely connected to the gala. A lighting operator, whose contract had ended weeks earlier, shared a chilling observation. "You could tell something was off before they even went on stage. The air around them felt heavy, like they were performing a version of themselves that was slipping out of sync." As these accounts piled up, they began to reveal a pattern that went deeper than one argument. It was the anatomy of pressure. Two people navigating fame, expectation, and exhaustion in real time. What the footage captured wasn't just conflict. It was the moment where years of restraint broke under the weight of unspoken frustration. Late that week, a journalist managed to secure an off-the-record meeting with one of the event organizers. They met at a small cafe far from the Manhattan press circuit. The organizer spoke quietly, their hands trembling slightly as they stirred a cup of coffee. "I shouldn't even be talking about this," they began. "But you need to understand." They weren't angry just at each other. They were angry at the situation. Everything around them that night was too controlled, too artificial. When people live under constant scrutiny, even small things start to feel unbearable. When pressed about the leak itself, the organizer hesitated. "We still don't know who did it," they admitted. "But I'll say this, it wasn't about money. Whoever shared that footage wanted to make a point." The journalist asked what point that might be. The organizer's eyes lowered. "That they're human," they said finally. "That even people who talk about healing sometimes need healing themselves." That remark spread like wildfire once it was public. The insiders who had broken their silence didn't just expose a story. They peeled back the veneer of perfection that had defined the Sussexes brand for years. Their testimonies painted a portrait not of scandal, but of strain, of a couple trying to live authentically under impossible conditions, and of the people around them forced to choose between loyalty and honesty. The leak had opened the door, and through it, the world glimpsed something it rarely saw: the raw, unfiltered humanity of those who had spent years trying to control their narrative. And once that door was open, no amount of denial or spin could close it again. The first sign that the situation had spiraled beyond containment came not from the media, but from the Sussexes' own public relations team. Archwell's Los Angeles headquarters, normally a calm operation focused on philanthropy updates and controlled releases, was thrown into chaos the moment the leaked video reached mainstream outlets. The couple's staff, accustomed to managing difficult headlines, quickly realized this was different. This was not speculation, rumor, or anonymous gossip. This was raw footage. Couldn't be denied, only managed. Within hours, emergency calls were scheduled between Archwell representatives, legal counsel, and a crisis communications firm that had previously worked with high-profile Hollywood clients. The first goal was to assess exposure. How many versions of the clip were circulating? Which outlets had obtained it? Could takedowns be enforced under copyright or privacy laws? The answers came back bleak. The video was everywhere. Screen-recorded, mirrored, and re-uploaded thousands of times. Removal was impossible. The second step was message control. Every public statement had to walk a razor-thin line between empathy and denial. Too defensive, and it would confirm guilt. Too emotional, and it would invite further scrutiny. Meghan's team drafted an initial press release describing the event as a misunderstanding captured out of context. Harry's advisors pushed for a softer approach, emphasizing the pressures of public life and the importance of compassion. The two statements were eventually merged into a single, neutral paragraph that said nothing concrete but sounded sincere enough to buy time. But time wasn't on their side. By the next morning, late-night talk shows were running segments on the royal meltdown, and trending hashtags mocked the couple's carefully curated image. Memes appeared faster than their team could counter them. Every facial expression in the video became a punchline. Analysts on YouTube produced 10-minute breakdowns of a 90-second clip, offering theories about what the couple might have been arguing about. Even respected media outlets joined in, publishing headlines that balanced speculation with feigned objectivity. In London, palace aides reportedly followed the story closely, though Buckingham Palace declined to comment. Some British tabloids framed the scandal as vindication, proof, they claimed, that the couple's polished public persona was merely a facade. Others treated it as entertainment, another chapter in the ongoing soap opera that the modern monarchy had become. The Sussexes had spent years trying to separate themselves from that narrative, but now they were right back in it, only without the palace machinery to shield them. Inside Archwell, the tension was palpable. Staff members avoided discussing the footage openly, but it dominated every conversation. The communications director, a seasoned strategist who had handled dozens of PR crises, described the challenge bluntly. When a narrative moves this fast, the truth doesn't matter anymore. What matters is control, and we just lost it. To regain momentum, the team decided to shift focus back to the cause. They flooded social media with posts highlighting Project Healthy Minds' mission and shared curated images of other mental health advocates from the event. The idea was to drown out the scandal by amplifying positivity. But the internet wasn't interested in redemption arcs. The footage had humanized the couple in a way that defied spin. Too real to ignore, too messy to polish. Still, they persisted. Within 48 hours, an exclusive interview offer was floated to a sympathetic U.S. network. The plan was simple: an in-depth conversation about mental health under pressure, without directly addressing the footage. Meghan was hesitant. She feared that appearing too soon would look reactive, even desperate. Harry, however, saw it differently. "We can't hide," he reportedly told his team. "If we don't speak, they'll speak for us." The network expressed interest but demanded conditions: no pre-screened questions, no veto power in post-production. That proposal was quickly rejected. The Sussexes had learned too many hard lessons about losing control of narratives. The interview was shelved indefinitely. Meanwhile, their legal team focused on tracing the source of the leak. They coordinated with Project Healthy Minds' internal investigators, reviewing Backstage access lists and digital security logs. But the deeper they looked, the murkier it became. There were no obvious suspects, no traceable digital fingerprints. Whoever recorded the video had been cautious, deliberate. Some theorized it was a disgruntled contractor. Others suspected an inside job by someone seeking to embarrass both the couple and the organization. Behind closed doors, frustration began to fracture alliances. Advisors blamed each other for not catching the problem earlier. Staff whispered about burnout and fear. Meghan reportedly confronted a senior aide after discovering that photos from the event had been approved for publication without her consent. "We can't afford another mistake," she said coldly. "Not one more." Harry, on the other hand, grew quieter. Those close to him noticed how withdrawn he had become, avoiding calls and limiting his public appearances. His friends described him as haunted by the sense that no matter what he did, the world was watching to see him fail. As public sympathy wavered, Archwell's donors began to worry. Several corporate partners privately requested reassurance that upcoming projects would remain unaffected. In philanthropy, perception is everything. A charity's image is its currency, and the Sussexes brand, once seen as fresh and inspiring, was showing cracks. Their team turned to what PR professionals call strategic redirection. Instead of denying the controversy, they sought to contextualize it. A statement was drafted emphasizing that mental health challenges can affect anyone, even those dedicated to supporting others. It was an attempt to reframe the footage as an educational moment, a teaching tool about stress, burnout, and emotional authenticity. The idea was clever in theory but transparent in execution. Critics called it damage control disguised as vulnerability. At the same time, Project Healthy Minds released its own carefully worded response. The organization condemned the unauthorized recording, citing a serious breach of trust, and reaffirmed its mission to create safe spaces for open dialogue. The statement avoided naming Harry and Meghan directly, but the implication was clear. Behind the scenes, their leadership was furious. The leak had not only compromised their event, but also endangered future partnerships. In private correspondence that later surfaced through anonymous leaks, one executive wrote, "This should have been a celebration of progress. Instead, it's a cautionary tale." By the end of the first week, Archwell's crisis team had exhausted every available strategy. The couple's social media accounts went silent. Scheduled appearances were quietly postponed. Invitations to speak at upcoming conferences were reconsidered. The strategy shifted from recovery to survival: ride out the storm, minimize visibility, and wait for the internet to move on. But the internet never really moves on. It archives everything. The video remained etched into the collective memory of the public, resurfacing whenever discussions about authenticity or hypocrisy arose. It became shorthand for the paradox of modern celebrity. The more one speaks about vulnerability, the more unforgiving the world becomes when it finally appears. Inside the couple's California home, the silence grew heavier. Meghan focused on managing Archewell's day-to-day operations remotely, but her once confident tone in meetings had softened. Harry threw himself into their charitable projects, but his enthusiasm seemed forced. "They were functioning," said one former employee, "but not living." Every conversation felt like strategy, not connection. As weeks passed, the scandal began to fade from front-page news, replaced by fresher controversies. Yet its shadow lingered. The footage had permanently altered the public's perception of the Sussexes. They were no longer untouchable advocates, they were flawed, fragile, human. And no amount of image management could restore the pristine narrative that had once defined them. Still, their team refused to surrender. A new strategy began to take shape, one rooted not in denial but in reclamation. If the footage showed them at their weakest, perhaps they could turn that vulnerability into strength. The idea was risky but potentially powerful, to confront the fallout not with polished statements, but with truth. Harry's closest advisor put it simply, "You can't win this with silence. You have to out-honest the story." Whether they would take that advice remained uncertain. But as the days passed and the media's appetite for spectacle waned, one thing was clear. The narrative was theirs to reclaim or to lose forever. The gala that had once promised redemption had instead exposed the cost of visibility. Now, amid the wreckage of reputations and broken trust, the real challenge began. Learning how to live when the entire world has already seen behind the curtain. In the first few weeks after the leak, the scandal was no longer about a single piece of footage. It became a symbol, an X-ray through the carefully constructed image of modern compassion and celebrity activism. The public had seen Prince Harry and Meghan Markle not as figureheads of empathy, but as people caught in the same emotions their campaigns claimed to heal. For the first time, the gap between message and reality had become too wide to ignore. The gala had been meant to showcase them as ambassadors of hope, champions of mental wellness, and examples of resilience in the face of relentless pressure. But now that image had collapsed under its own weight. The contrast between their speech on mindfulness and the leaked argument backstage created an almost unbearable irony. The couple who spoke about patience and understanding were now seen shouting in frustration, their voices raw with anger and exhaustion. Online reactions hardened into camps. Supporters insisted the footage showed nothing more than a moment of stress. "Everyone has bad days," wrote one fan account with millions of followers. "They're human, not robots." But the critics were louder. They accused the couple of hypocrisy, of using mental health as a shield for self-interest. Hashtags like #RoyalMeltdown and #BehindTheFacade trended for days, each tweet a fresh wound in the couple's public identity. Meanwhile, major publications began to frame the story as a cautionary tale. Editorials spoke about the dangers of performative empathy, the way modern public figures had turned vulnerability into a brand. One headline read, "When compassion becomes a commodity." The article beneath it dissected the Sussexes' media empire, arguing that authenticity loses meaning when it becomes monetized. It wasn't just the press that shifted. The public tone around mental health advocacy itself began to change. For years, Harry and Meghan had positioned themselves as the relatable faces of emotional wellness, people who could bridge the gap between royalty and reality. But now, even well-intentioned observers wondered if the movement they helped popularize had been tainted by its most visible ambassadors. Behind the scenes, their team tried to mitigate the damage. Advisors encouraged them to double down on sincerity, to issue an open letter addressing what had happened, not as a scandal, but as an example of the very struggles they often discussed. Meghan was initially open to the idea. She saw it as a chance to reclaim control, to remind people that even advocates of calm could lose their composure under immense pressure. But Harry hesitated. He feared it would sound calculated, another performance masquerading as vulnerability. "We've already given them too much of us," he said during one late-night strategy call. "If we try to explain this, they'll only tear it apart again." The indecision created paralysis. Every potential step felt like a trap. To speak was to risk mockery. To remain silent was to seem guilty. And so, the silence stretched on, deepening the sense of mystery around them. The institutions they had once championed began to distance themselves quietly. Invitations to keynote conferences were postponed. A documentary project on emotional resilience that had been in development with a major streaming service went on indefinite hold. Even Project Healthy Minds, which had once called them allies, issued a carefully worded update clarifying that the couple played no role in the operational management of the event. It was a polite way of saying, "This was not our problem." Among those who had attended the gala, stories began to resurface. Small anecdotes that once seemed harmless now took on a darker hue. A production assistant recalled how Meghan had demanded multiple lighting adjustments before her speech. She said the stage light made her skin look washed out, the assistant told a magazine. It wasn't vanity, it was control. Everything had to be perfect. Another staffer remembered Harry pacing near the exit before the ceremony, running his hands through his hair, muttering under his breath. He looked like a man about to take an exam he hadn't studied for. These recollections painted a picture not of villains but of fragility. The pressure to maintain perfection, to embody grace while under a microscope, had become its own psychological burden. But public sympathy was fleeting. The more the couple tried to humanize themselves, the more people seemed to hold them to impossible standards. Television pundits and royal commentators filled endless airtime debating the footage's implications. Some argued that the couple had simply been exposed as what they always were, two people who mistook celebrity activism for genuine service. Others claimed the public had misunderstood the moment entirely. "We demand authenticity," said one commentator. "But when we see it, we recoil. We don't want real people. We want saints." Through all of it, one recurring phrase echoed across social media. The mask slipped. It became the shorthand for the entire incident, a metaphor for what happens when curated perfection gives way to emotional truth. The phrase appeared in tweets, articles, and headlines until it no longer described a single night but an entire era of their public life. Even those who had once defended them began to falter. A well-known American journalist, previously sympathetic to the Sussexes' cause, published a column titled "When Advocacy Becomes Exhaustion." The piece argued that constant visibility had eroded their credibility. There is a difference between sharing your struggles and living your life as a struggle to be shared. It was a quiet indictment, and it resonated widely. Inside the Archwell offices, morale was collapsing. Several junior employees resigned within 2 weeks, citing stress and uncertainty. The communications department was under siege, flooded with calls from reporters. The internal Slack channels that once buzzed with optimism were now filled with silence, punctuated by terse reminders about confidentiality. Every move was second-guessed. Every email was drafted, revised, and redrafted. To make matters worse, the couple's closest friends were divided. Some urged them to fight back, to sue whoever was responsible. Others warned them that legal aggression would only reignite the story. Meghan's mother, Doria, reportedly advised patience. "Let them talk," she said. "They'll move on. They always do." But patience was a luxury the modern media cycle didn't grant. Weeks turned into months, and though the headlines softened, the stigma remained. The footage lingered in the public imagination like a ghost, replayed, remixed, referenced. Every time Meghan appeared in public afterward, commentators looked for signs of strain, of lingering resentment. Every time Harry spoke about mental health, someone online inevitably posted a clip of that backstage argument with the caption, "Practice what you preach." The damage wasn't fatal, but it was corrosive. It chipped away at the foundation of trust they had built with their audience. The image of the empathetic reformers, the couple who had walked away from royal privilege to live authentically, was gone. In its place stood two people trying to manage the fallout of being too human in a world that demanded perfection. Even their allies in Hollywood began to tread carefully. Invitations to red carpet events continued, but the camera flashes felt different, colder, more curious than admiring. Industry insiders whispered about whether the couple's brand had peaked. They're still valuable, one PR executive told a trade publication. But the shine is gone. They used to symbolize freedom and compassion. Now they symbolize controversy. And yet, amid the chaos, something shifted quietly beneath the surface. For the first time since stepping back from royal duties, Harry and Meghan stopped trying to control their story. The machinery of spin slowed. There were no grand interviews, no carefully curated photo shoots. Instead, they disappeared from public view, retreating into silence. That silence, paradoxically, became their most powerful statement. Without the distraction of constant narrative management, the noise surrounding them began to fade. Some critics grew bored. Others moved on to fresher scandals. A few observers even began to wonder aloud if perhaps the couple deserved a measure of grace after all. But those closest to them knew the truth. The silence wasn't strategic. It was survival. The humanitarian facade hadn't just cracked in the public eye. It had collapsed under the weight of their own expectations. They had spent years building an identity around healing others, but they had neglected to heal themselves. And so, behind closed doors, the work of rebuilding began. Not for cameras, not for causes, but for the two people who had forgotten what it meant to be ordinary. The footage had taken something from them, but it had also forced a reckoning. The mask was gone, and in its place stood something far more fragile, but perhaps more real. For the world, it was the end of a narrative. For Harry and Meghan, it was only the beginning of one they hadn't chosen but could no longer avoid. The story of what happens when the image you create to save yourself becomes the very thing that breaks you. Once the dust of gossip began to settle, a new wave of scrutiny emerged. Not from tabloid journalists or royal commentators this time, but from analysts, psychologists, and behavioral specialists determined to decode what had actually happened in that dimly lit backstage space. The footage had become a case study in human emotion, dissected not just for entertainment but as a mirror reflecting the cost of pressure, image, and emotional exhaustion.